even beyond white magic. I even want to whatever it is, right? Something. So we got to define something new. I think there's a new model here. And when we think about white magic, at least what I do, I think of something in my head, conjure something up, but it's always in opposition to black magic. I feel like we need to, plumb some new depth, and because that's where we are now. We're different. The world is different. Our biology is different. So, but I'm in complete agreement with you, Krys, and I think it's about time that we begin to have this discussion.
We're at the nadir of spirituality and the apex of materialism. So it's very, very almost impossible.
Well, what's really interesting, and we'll dive into the D stuff in a minute here. But I was having a great conversation with a new client today, and she talked about a very specific day where she was working with her at that time spiritual teacher. And this was on the 15th of May back in 1984. So this is, at that time, it was Wesak, that?
Yeah, Wesak moon.
Yeah, so Scorpio moon during the month of Taurus. So I looked at her chart, and sure enough, wow, she had this major Kundalini experience, changes her life during that time. But I also looked at, this period roughly between, 1981 and about 1985. There's about 4 years there. At 81 to 85, when both Neptune and Uranus are in Sagittarius. So these are really kind of high vibrational, spiritual, high consciousness aspects in the outer planets. And even though Neptune was much further along, because Neptune went into Sagittarius around late 70, early 71, right around then. And it's a very interesting time for Neptune because right around that time, I'm sure both of you kind of remember this, is that there's this real rush of religious and Christian-oriented media and film. You have, Brother Sun, Sister Moon, Jesus Christ Superstar, and there's at least 3 or 4 more major films that have these kind of theatrical, Christ-driven sorts of, themes.
Godspell.
Right, Godspell, thank you. That was the other one. I was trying to think. There's Godspell that happens then. There's also that film with Robert, what's his name? Is it Robert Powell, The Life of Jesus? I think that comes out right around that time. You've got the song by the Doobie Brothers, Jesus Is Just All Right With Me. There are all these really interesting cultural ciphers that are happening right around that time. And that's when Neptune goes into Sagittarius. It's a very spiritual period in a lot of ways. And then Uranus comes in right around 1981. So for about 3.5 years, 4 years, about 4 years, there's this real hum that's happening spiritually. There was a real portal because I had a lot of stuff happen to me during that time. And I was talking with her. We were comparing notes. It's things were happening. I was open. This was going on. And I was having, so I just want to throw that back to you guys. Do you have any kind of recollection of what's going on with you?
Yeah. Well, that was 85 was the year we made our first trip to Turkey and did backpack for a month. That was our first date. That was huge. And we were in the ashram.
And then we started, and so at that point, we started studying a very traditional form of yoga. Well, it was not even a form of yoga. It was just
classical.
Just basic classical yoga. It wasn't any particular school that this woman kind of brought from Calcutta. And it was a one-off ashram, and we were there for, a decade.
11 years.
And, learned Sanskrit, Bhagavad Gita, Upanishads, and Western philosophy. So it was really, really well,
full package,
smartly done. And so that's kind of when we started really delving into, serious, regular meditation practice. And it was kind of right after a bunch of traveling in the early 80s.
Yeah.
So it kind of makes sense. That is, so that kind of catapulted us along. And then we did that from about 85 to 95, where we kind of really, really cloistered ourselves in a lot of ways. It wasn't a live-in ashram, but it may as well have been,
Right.
Yeah, we were there every day and studying at night and classes at night and so on and so forth.
Well, it sounds real disciplined.
Extremely so. Very, very disciplined.
And we got a traditional spiritual education that, so we live in Asheville. A lot of people are very spiritual. They do different things, but no one's had a soup to nuts spiritual education, a traditional spiritual education. So we're very lucky to have that. And then you have that once you kind of take, it's the old story. If you take one path to the end, then you kind of know all of them. You kind of get it. So they're all, similar technologies because we're all human, and the connections are all the same.
And yoga is a technology.
Sure is, yeah.
And it gave us a language. That's what I so appreciated about it. It gave us a language for describing human experience. It was like you took human experience and put it under a microscope and see, oh, that's what's happening. That's how it works. It gives you great clarity, just even the studying of it.
Yeah. I remember I went through a very intensive phase with yoga when I was during that 81 to 85 period. That was time when I was doing a lot. I was doing a lot of yoga. I was in my heavy duty ascetic phase back then. Man, that was a good time.
It's good to have a discipline.
Yeah. So let's take a deep dive into Dee, and then we'll wade on over into Francis Bacon. So Steve, you want to get us going on that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Steve's going to carry the ball.
A couple of things one of the things that we didn't talk about last time that I did want to mention that would be of interest to you was that in 1580 or so, Dee was on the Glastonbury tour. Now, the Glastonbury tour is considered the most sacred part of England by many people. Glastonbury is supposedly ancient Avalon. Arthur is buried there supposedly, or where he sailed off into the mists.
The mists of Avalon.
Yes, and so Dee stood on top of the tor, and there's a church. There's a little tower to Bridget on the tor that they took the goddess Bridget and demoted her to a saint. And from the tor, Dee looked around and he saw the zodiac in the landscape itself.
Yeah, I could see that. I could actually see that.
And so,
I've been there, and I've seen the little islands in the mist, and I could actually see where he could see that.
Exactly. And so it really wasn't up until the early 1900s where a woman wrote about it. But a friend of mine actually found it in one of John Michel's book. I'm kind of fond of John Michel, and apparently Dee saw this, several hundred years before, and made some mention of it. It must have been, I think it's in his diary somewhere. So, and this is just as a sort of a side thing that there are a number of places where where the zodiac is placed on the earth. There's a whole series of them around each of the ancient Greek cities, Delphi, places like that. That's in there. Chris wants to.
Can either of you explain to me how you see the zodiac in the landscape?
Well,
what does that mean?
Well, physically, he would see the shapes in the form of the constellations. He would actually see the constellations in water and mounds and things like that. And
so if you okay, I went to Glastonbury one time. Again, this is in that 1984 period. In fact, I was there in November of 1984. So I went up to the top of the tour, and I did my very sacred walk, circumnavigating everything. We got to the top up there. And I was there early in the morning to watch the sunrise. When I got there, there was literally like an ocean of fog that had descended onto the valley. And you could see all these other little mounds all around the valley, right? So I'm assuming at that time, because there was very little in terms of building or construction, that Dee could have a 360-degree view of the landscape and all these various mounds that were sort of rising through the Avalonian mist, which is what that refers to. So I could actually get that, but because there's enough sort of geophysical activity there that I'm sure somebody who is switched on could see some patterns, and I don't think that'd be out of the question. So that answer your question, Victor?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and that also maps on to some of the other things, like, for example, all the Gothic churches built in France, which were almost all to Mary, Chartres being the most amazing of them to my mind, but they all map onto the constellation Virgo, where they are placed in the landscape. Mm-hmm. When we actually were lucky enough to go to Cambodia in 2001. And the temples there were actually in the form of Draco, the Angkor temples. And so, so there's always been this sort of mapping of the heavens onto the Earth landscape.
You know where else they do it is in Major League Baseball parks.
Do they?
Major League Baseball parks are always slightly northeast. Home plate in every single Major League Baseball park is always slightly northeast, so that it aligns with Sirius.
Honestly.
Absolutely. Think about being at Yankee Stadium. Think about being at Shea Stadium. Think of where home plate, right, is located. It's always facing east and slightly north.
It's just a slight, huh?
It's just like every single stadium I've ever been, because I've thought about it. It's like, oh, that's interesting. I heard about it, and I've gone through every single stadium in my head, and they're all aligned in the same direction.
Steve should have put that in his book.
So seriously, I'll have to rewrite that chapter in my book.
So that actually gives credence to what you're talking about.
Yeah. So and it's always so we're always in some way trying to, re-enchant this landscape, and this connection between the celestial and the terrestrial, which is obviously something that Dee was interested in, and we get into Francis Bacon, and then it kind of leads into the Dee Tower. Okay, so what I'm calling the Dee Tower. So in Newport, Rhode Island, there's a tower, and there's basically just the foundations of it that are left. 28 feet of it are left. So this tower has 8 arches. What a certain professor discovered, professor of astronomy.
Is this Jim Egan?
No, not the Jim Egan isn't a professor, but he's the guy who popularized it. Okay. What this professor started looking at it and says, well, the windows are kind of uneven. You can even see in this picture, one's a little higher than the other. So he started figuring, well, maybe there's some, celestial alignments with it. And lo and behold, the guy finds something like 16 various celestial alignments. One of them, for example, is the moon cycle. So the moon, the sun moves, it rises a different point every day across the horizon. So the moon does the same thing. But the sun is a 1 year cycle, of course. The moon is an 18.6 year cycle. So he was able to find at the end of the cycle, he predicted that you look through these 2 particular windows, the moon's going to rise right there, and it did. So that's one of the things that he found out. But all sorts of solstice and equinox alignments, so all these things, because originally it was on a little bit of a hill and it looked out over the ocean. The other thing that was really interesting about this tower that they found was that it was operating at what's called a camera obscura. The most common camera obscura is our eyes. So our eyes have little, the pupil. And what happens is, light comes in, the image isn't reversed in our head, and it's our brain that actually re-inverses the image so that we see things right side up. But you can do this with every camera does that. And so what you can do, and the reason why this guy Jim Egan figures that it was Dee, among other things, that designed this tower. I mean, there's theories all over the place as to who built it, whether it was the Vikings to who knows who. But Dee was probably the only person in England who knew about camera obscuras at that time. And because Dee was educated